Hi everybody, this is your video lecture for the first poem that we're reading in this class. I chose Poetry by Marianne Moore. So first we see Marianne Moore. She was born in 1887, died in 1972. One of the first things I want to draw your attention to here in this poem is that it, of course, is not written in sentences and paragraphs. So I talked about how the big difference between prose, which is what stories are written in, how prose is written in sentences and paragraphs. And sometimes they might be very short paragraphs. Sometimes when writers have stories with dialogue, right, there's only just one sentence and then it does a paragraph break before the next bit of dialogue. That is still considered prose and sentences and paragraphs. What we have here is something written in lines and stanzas. So, for example, it is the alignment is strange. You see that it's almost like a hanging indentation. That's because the poet can choose where to do line breaks instead of going from one margin all the way to the other margin, and if the sentence is continuing, it goes back to the margin. Look, they have chosen to break this line right here, and then that it should be indented slightly, and that this is the beginning of a new sentence, but they have done it like a paragraph break, indented, but not quite that much. And you can see they choose this one. There's no reason why this line couldn't have been up here if it were prose, but since it's poetry, the poet has decided that it creates some meaning or some added feeling, or it has some effect on the reader when they break the line there, and perhaps it's just to draw emphasis to the rest of the line or to encourage it to be read in a certain way. And you can see there is a bit of a break here before the poem continues, and this is, if you look at the punctuation and capitalization, it would seem like it's the same sentence, right? But they have broken it into a new stanza here. So let's go ahead and start to look at it. She says, "I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle." So what do you think she's talking about? Based on the title, I would say she is talking about poetry. It's an interesting statement for a poet to make, that I dislike poetry. She's saying, I too dislike poetry. She's saying it to you, the reader, almost assuming that you don't like poetry. Is that true? How many of you like poetry? Well, she's saying to those of you who don't like it, she's saying, I don't like it either. She's saying, I also don't like poetry. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle, right? She's saying there are more important things than this silliness. This fiddle, not just a musical instrument, but it also has this older meaning. So she's playing with the meaning of the word there. This older meaning that it's like fraudulent nonsense. She says there's more important stuff beyond all this crap, basically. She says, reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, she says, when you read it and you hate it, you discover that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. So she says there's a place, even if you hate it, when you read it, you can discover that poetry, there's a place in poetry for things that are real, things that are genuine, things that are legitimate. If you read some of those definitions of poetry that I talked about, a few of those definitions, they talk about truth, how poetry is designed to bring truth to you. And so that's maybe what she's talking about. There's a place in poetry for the genuine, for the real. She says hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important, not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. So she's giving you imagery here. That's something that poets do a lot. They give you images that you can really focus on. Hands that can grab things, eyes that can dilate, right, like the pupils dilate. Hair that can rise, like when you get scared and the hair rises on your arms or the back of your neck. These things are important not because they can be They can have some interesting interpretation in the poem, she says, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we can't understand. So she says when poetry when it presents something real, something genuine, images and feelings that are useful to you, that you can appreciate and that you can relate to, then it has value. But when it becomes so derivative meaning that it is just the same as everyone else, copying everyone else, then that it's so derivative it becomes unintelligible. And that means it doesn't make any sense. The same may be said. She says, we do not admire what we cannot understand. So, poetry that can't be understood has little value. And when it is unintelligible, and when it is derivative, when it's trying to be like other poetry, or when it's just trying to have some important interpretation, she says maybe that has less value. And she offers more images: the bat holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse that feels a flea. Now, this is more than just an image here. This is a simile. She's created figurative language because she talks about a person, a critic, someone who criticizes, right? The immovable critic. That's the person who says something doesn't have good value, or someone who interprets literature, for example, and discusses its value. She says when he wrinkles his skin up, when he twitches his skin like a horse that feels a flea. So she's making this comparison. This is figurative language. She's using an image of a horse that moves its skin because it feels a bug, and she's comparing it to a person who reads something he doesn't like and maybe wrinkles his nose. She says the baseball fan, the statistician, case after case could be cited did one wish it. Nor is it valid to discriminate against, quote, business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. She says all of these things you can bring meaning to them. She's talking about images, right? She's talking about people and their stories, even things that might seem unimportant or uninteresting, like business documents and school book. They may be important, but one must make a distinction. She says when dragged into prominence by half poets, the result is not poetry. So a real poet, she's saying a real poet can give you the image of a wild horse and bring some profound meaning to it. A real poet, not a half poet, a real poet can describe a wolf under a tree, and it can have a profound meaning to you, some meaning that you hadn't thought of it before, some meaning that's important to your life. A real poet can describe that. A real poet can compare a person, like a critic, to a horse. And you might take great meaning from it and look at that person in a different way and look at things in a different way because they are a real poet. But if a half poet, if someone who's just trying to be a poet tries to describe these things and drag them into prominence, then the result is not poetry. She says until autocrats among us, those are the people who try to control everything, right? Until they can be the literalists of the imagination, make things that are imaginary into things that are real, things that are literal. She says above the insolence and triviality and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, until those people can create real things out of imaginary things like the poets do. And then shall we have it, she says. In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, in defiance of their opinion, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, then you're interested in poetry. She says an interest in poetry is not about all those fancy interpretations and talking about some of the poetic devices that we'll talk about during the during this semester, like figurative language and similes. She says if you're interested in the raw material, in just the way it makes you feel, and the images that are presented, and what meaning might be behind it, right? If you're interested in what's genuine about it, what's real and true behind poetry, she said that is an interest in poetry. And so she's trying to explain poetry to those who maybe hate it. Like she says, she hates it sometimes, right? She dislikes it. But there's something in it that brings truth and brings new understanding to ideas.